everybody. We're here semi-live from Kansas City, where there's any number of jokes that could be made about that, but we'll leave it alone. And today we're talking about American jazz with Union Public Library. I'm Debbie Walter, which I always forget to say. I'm very excited to have you here. I want you to all like us on Facebook so you can keep informed about what we're doing. In the meantime, I'm so happy to introduce James Mcgee Sr., who is Senior Manager of Visitor and Virtual Experiences at American Jazz Museum. So James, take it away.
All right. Hello, everybody. Hope you all can hear me well. Debbie, can you hear me good?
Perfect.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for taking your time out this evening to spend some time with us here at the American Jazz Museum. When Debbie contacted me about this opportunity, we were really excited to just really share our museum, our organization, and our story with folks that are outside of our area, especially. So, you know, during this time of COVID with museums and different in-person activities being limited, this is a great way for us to kind of still share that information and almost more importantly, get input from the community on, you know, what they think about our museum here. So again, like Debbie said, my name is James Mcgee Sr. I am the Senior Manager of Visitor and Virtual Experience here at the American Jazz Museum. The American Jazz Museum was founded and actually placed here in the 18th and Vine Jazz District in 1997. During the mid-90s, around 95, 96, there was a resurgence of an interest in Kansas City jazz in particular. There was actually some things that were done here to kind of try to rejuvenate what was known as kind of the hub of Kansas City jazz. For those jazz fans and jazz aficionados out there, or for those who just don't know that much about it, people normally look at jazz as having like four main pillars of cities, areas in the country. It doesn't mean that there's not other places where jazz comes out of, but at the early inception of when jazz became popular, there were four main pillars. So you have New Orleans, Chicago, New York, and Kansas City as the four initial main pillars of how jazz began to travel and expand as a musical art form, what some of us call today America's only original art form, known the world around. So the Kansas City style of jazz is basically an expansion from the New Orleans style of jazz. New Orleans is credited with the actual cradle of the birth of jazz, the mixture of African music, African rhythms, the stories and the things that were brought over during the transatlantic slave trade, and then mixing those things with European styles of music and instruments kind of lent itself to create this hybrid music that had these classical instruments that are being used like brass or woodwinds, but kind of put to the Black experience or the African American experience. So that's where we kind of consider jazz is birthplace is New Orleans. So as you know, coming up the Mississippi, coming into Missouri, you know, you start to get into other areas. So Kansas City was one of those stops. The history behind that is really, and we'll go through the museum, but I always like to start off with giving everybody just a little bit of context of how Kansas City came into the jazz fold and how it influenced the rest of the world and how it influenced other styles of jazz and what kind of culture was here to create it. So after what would be considered, I guess, the second great migration north, which would have been around, you know, after World War I, a lot of African Americans started coming up from the South up to the Midwest, as well as the North and East Coast, looking for jobs, looking for opportunity, more work. A lot of them arrived here in Kansas City. So the Black population that began to expand here in Kansas City was particularly unique because at one point it went from being around 4,000 Black people to about 40,000. So the population explosion expansion was very fast and had an extreme impact on the area here. So for those who don't know, Tom Pendergast was known as a political boss here in Kansas City around the turn of the century. So with him being here and kind of seeing that there was an explosion of African Americans or Blacks in the city at that time, and knowing during that time we were dealing with much more harsh redlining and segregation, where people just didn't want to live around each other. Whites didn't want to live around Blacks and minority things like that. So Black people were being disenfranchised, but Tom Pendergast, being the businessman that he is, and being, I guess, maybe a visionary and a bit of an opportunist, made allegiance with some of the Black leaders in Kansas City, particularly one like Felix Payne, who was known as a bit of a music impresario, a club owner, a gambler, a policymaker. At that time, much like in every other cities, politics, crime, organized crime, vice, all of that stuff worked together. So if you take all of that, you take the political machine of Tom Pendergast, you take the underworld connections of a Felix Payne, and you take an explosion of a Black community in Kansas City, it made sense for them to say, hey, we're going to create an area where the Black population in Kansas City can have basically a city within a city. So what you have is from about Independence Avenue, which is about what we would consider, I guess, 6th Street here in Kansas City, to about 18th Street. That would be the border for the Black population north to south. And then there is a street called Troost on the west, and a street called Prospect on the east. That was the radius where most Black families lived from around the early 20th century until probably about the 1970s, when they started to desegregate certain neighborhoods and laws like that. So there was a large concentration of African Americans there. So what happened is, in turn with that, all of these musicians started traveling up here because they saw that there was a Black community that was thriving. It had restaurants, businesses, clubs, theaters. It was just like a city within a city. So they were like, hey, there's a place where we can go and work. We can work, and we can also work as musicians. So they came here kind of looking for that opportunity. And when they got here, the big surprise that they got was not only was Kansas City a less segregated area than maybe some of the places in the South, but Tom Pendergast and his political machine during Prohibition basically enforced a wide open city policy in Kansas City, which meant that vice, prostitution, gambling, alcohol, all of that was basically, a blind eye was turned to it in Kansas City. I won't go as far as to say as it was legal, but people weren't prosecuted for the crimes like they were in the other countries. Everywhere else around the country during the Prohibition era, law enforcement was cracking down. In Kansas City, it was known as a wide open town. That's why it got the nickname the Paris of the Plains. And it's kind of like the Las Vegas before Las Vegas. So you mix all that stuff in right there, and then you get a great opportunity for musicians. You get a great opportunity for creative inspiration and that spark. You have women, you have liquor, you have vice, you have music. It's wide open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. What better place for musicians to kind of grow their craft? And that's where you get that energized concentration of music creation and jazz in Kansas City. So it wasn't like it wasn't just like a thing that just happened by happenstance. There was a lot of deliberate things that went on to create Kansas City and create this entertainment mecca. And that's kind of how the jazz scene and the music scene here started to kind of grow and thrive, because people were just allowed to do what they wanted to do. So with that being said, there's just a little bit of context in history on how we got to become such a fertile place for the creation of jazz. So in 1997, it was just thought that, since Kansas City is such an incremental part of jazz, American history, music history, world history, that we should honor the music form that came from here, as well as the musicians, and almost just importantly, the space and the place. So the American Jazz Museum is located in what is known as the historic 18th and Vine District. Again, like I said, the 18th and Vine District was where a lot of Black businesses and residents kind of thrived and kind of built their own city within a city. So a lot of the the properties that are managed by the American Jazz Museum are still their original properties from what was here at that time, like our gym theater that was built in 1912 and then restored in 1997. At first, it was a movie theater, and then it became a place for concerts and just different events for the neighborhood. So that's still here. What I'm in right now, we'll start our tour, is I am in the Blue Room. The Blue Room is one of the clubs that had its heyday during Kansas City's golden era of jazz, which would have went about from 1925 to about 1945 for the actual concentration, a good 20-year span of a lot of musicians just coming here and really just gravitating to this place and making their home Kansas City. A lot of the bands were territory bands that came from Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, but again, they all found their way and made their home in Kansas City because of the opportunities. So I'm in the Blue Room, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start our tour here. Are we still good on sound? Can Debbie, can everybody hear me?
I think so.
All right. Okay.
Put in voice in chat.
I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?
If you can't hear us, put it in the chat.
Okay. Right. So where we're at is the Blue Room. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip the camera around so you can get a view of what it would be if you were actually here, or shall I say, when you actually come visit us. So on any given night during, pre-COVID and about to start up here soon, I would say Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, the Blue Room was designed as part of the American Jazz Museum exhibit. So it's really a part of the museum, but there was such a thirst and yearning for that throwback time of Kansas City's golden era of jazz that they went ahead and just made it into a fully functional jazz club. So this jazz club, the Blue Room, has been on top list of jazz venues in America and internationally for at least the last 20 years. So we have a lot of great artists come through here and play. So when you're ever in Kansas City, first come check out the American Jazz Museum, and then make sure you come on out that evening and come hang out with us and listen to some live jazz here at the Blue Room. This piece here that I'm going to go up to, that I'm approaching here, this piece here was done in 1990 by Miss Holly Hughes, and it's titled "God Bless the Child Who Has His Own." It's paying tribute to Billie Holiday. It was made using recycled products, things that were just kind of discarded, and it's just a great multimedia piece that was designed that's very unique to the Blue Room and honoring Miss Billie Holiday. All right. So on any given night when you come here, we have this different area. And one of the main parts of the Blue Room, the reason why it was kind of set aside from the rest of the exhibit is because this is where we concentrate on a lot of the history of Kansas City jazz musicians and some of the more influential early jazz musicians from Kansas City. The American Jazz Museum as a whole covers jazz as a whole as a one art form, but we do make sure that we honor our Kansas City based musicians that really help to architect what we know as Kansas City jazz and various other forms of pop jazz. One interesting point that I'm going to bring out here is this is a exhibit and piece featuring Mary Lou Williams. Mary Lou Williams is a very unique person in the history of jazz because Mary Lou Williams was one of few, or not very many, really at that time, maybe the only one of her time or particular period that was actually a composer and an arranger and a band leader. As we all know, during times when Mary Lou Williams came in, 20s and 30s and 40s, women were not really seen as band leaders or composers or arrangers or the people that would be in front. Those positions were more reserved for men for leadership. So here in Kansas City, Mary Lou Williams was respected by the musicians and just really kind of looked at as a peer, and that kind of opened the door for that, for her to be among those first composers and arrangers of a female, writing for Count Basie, Charlie Parker, with Duke Ellington. So that was a really big thing that happened during that time and during her lifetime. So we really like to honor her here. So if you ever have some time, make sure you look at more on her. As I was mentioning about the territory bands, this is a saxophone from one of the territory bands that made its way and made itself famous throughout the region, but actually landed in Kansas City, the Blue Devils. They were actually a band that was based out of Oklahoma, I believe, or founded in Oklahoma. So this is a alto sax, and this belonged to Henry Buster Smith, who played in several famous Kansas City bands, including the Blue Devils. So the Blue Devils was kind of like one of the premier jazz bands of its day. So a lot of the more influential artists would have really desired to be with that group or gone through that group and kind of made their bones and kind of worked their chops up through there. Move around. Another great Kansas City musician that we always try to make sure we honor is Jay Mcshane, or Jay Hootie Mcshane, a great pianist, songwriter, based out of Kansas City. Charlie Parker was in his band. That was one of his first actual band gigs, is with the Jay Mcshane band. And Jay Mcshane was right up there with the Count Basies and Duke Ellingtons as far as just the respect that people had from him as a musician, but just always just, maintain himself here in Kansas City. Was here till he passed away and just made Kansas City his home, and was always an advocate for jazz music, especially the music from his hometown. Also, Jay Mcshane's orchestra played a lot of music that had swinging rhythms to it. So he was in that first line of swing bands that kind of ushered that sound in. So that's kind of where he got some of his influence in there. And another thing about Kansas City jazz is that it was based on a 12-bar blues. So that's another thing that made it a little different than the New Orleans sound or the Chicago sound or the New York sound. It was based on a 12 bars blues where it kind of had more of a danceable swing to it that kind of made people want to get up and do that. Kansas City was known as one of the places that had huge dance halls that would fit hundreds of people in there, all dancing to jazz and big bands. So this is a really special section here. This is one of our little known treasures here in Kansas City. This part is dedicated to Local 627, which was the Black Musicians Union. It was the part of the American Federation of Musicians, but of course, during that time, even unions were segregated. So there was the white union that was Local 34, and there was the Black union, which is Local 627. So all of the musicians that I talk about on this tour, whether they're from Kansas City or from other places and made Kansas City home or came through Kansas City to play music, they all had to either be a member or sign in and pay dues with Local 627, which is now known as the Mutual Musicians Foundation. When desegregation laws came down in about 1970, they integrated the union and they decided to keep the building. So the members that were still there actually kept the building and made it a private musicians union or a musician social club, which still stands today. It's known as the Mutual Musicians Foundation. It's at 1823 Highland, which is right around the corner from here. It is a National Historic Landmark, and it is the first National Historic Landmark in Kansas City. The second one is the World War I memorial. So that's how influential jazz and Kansas City style of jazz was to the state, the country, and the world. So another person I'd like to kind of point out before we get any further is Benny Moton. Jazz is a music that, especially in its inception, was all about passing down the lineage and the heritage, the skills, the wisdom, and knowledge from one musician to another. Very community-based type of music. So Benny Moton, we do a thing here in the 18th Vine District every year around International Jazz Day called Benny, Basie, and Bird. And the line is that Benny Moton was a band leader, had a very popular band here in Kansas City, which Count Basie was a part of. Then Count Basie, of course, went on to have his own band and his own fame. And then after Jay Mcshane's band, Charlie Parker joins and plays with Count Basie. So you have Benny, Basie, and Bird. There's a lineage. There's one elder or mentor passing it down to the next person, passing it down to the next person who is continuously elevating the music and the sound and changing it and taking it to different places. So I like to kind of brag about that kind of relationship we have here in Kansas City with our young musicians. We try to keep that going still. This is a soprano saxophone that belonged to Bud Johnson. He was primarily a tenor saxophonist, but he also played and recorded the soprano, alto, baritone, and saxophone. So he was part of a significant of the emergence of Bach. He definitely had a significant role in that, writing arrangements for big bands and things of that nature. So, and then we have some of our vocalists, which is one of my favorites is Big Joe Turner. Jump in the Blues. Joe Turner, in his early career, was known as the singing bartender. So he was a bigger fellow, and he would work at Felix Payne's clubs, and he would be bartending and singing, and everybody would say, "Hey, where's that big singing bartender?" So he was known as the singing bartender. But then when he started working with Pete Johnson, a pianist here in Kansas City, they started creating sounds that kind of started to mold that boogie woogie sound of music that went into kind of becoming what we all know as rock and roll. So Joe Turner is one of the first. He actually has a song with Pete Johnson called Piney Brown Blues. If you ever get a chance to look it up, Piney Brown Blues. And that song is really kind of the precursor to the Kansas City song that we know, Going to Kansas City. It has a lot of the similar lyrics and similar cadence, just a little bit of a different storyline. So if you ever get a chance to check that out, go listen to Piney Brown Blues, and you'll hear Big Joe Turner, one of the premier jazz vocalist and blues vocalist, and one of the architects of early rock and roll, along with Pete Johnson. All right. So right now I have some time for a few questions. If anybody has a few questions they want to ask before we make our way into the main exhibit.
So I just clicked that you can unmute yourself if you want to. Are there any questions?
May I ask a question? This is Diane. Hi. So far,
Hello.
I've really been enjoying this. You're doing a
All right.
great job.
Okay.
I'm going to ask you something, and I apologize, but I had to step away to answer the door, and you may have already said this. But what attracted the Black population to Kansas City initially?
Okay.
Because the open city idea, I thought, came after the population was there.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So the initial attraction was the second Great Migration after World War I. So after World War I, you had a lot more Black, a larger Black population migrating up from the South to get the jobs that were available because of the war that was going on in World War I. So during and right after is when you start to see a big influx of African Americans coming from the South. So by the time you get to the early 1920s, the mid 1920s, you start having musicians coming up as well because they're coming up for the same opportunities. But then 5 years after that, 1930, it's just prime time at that point. So that's kind of an extra explosion happened because the migration was already occurring. And then once it was known that, hey, Kansas City is not only a place where Black people can come and have opportunity, but musically and culturally wise is wide open. That was a huge explosion from that point on.
Right.
Yeah.
But what was the industry that attracted them initially? I guess that's the thing that's focused in the back of my mind. There had to be an industry or something in Kansas City for the migration to head in that. It's because I could understand New York and Chicago, but I'm just surprised about Kansas City.
The stockyards, cattle. Kansas City was a main hub, especially if you are historic West Bottom area. The stockyards and cattle was like a huge driver for industry in Kansas City. It's the middle of the country, so beef products and food products going back and forth. This was like the central hub for a lot of those distribution points during that time. Did I answer your question?
I clicked mute so we could move on, but I'm still answering the question. And Diane, you'll have another chance to ask it again.
Okay.
So just to keep it going here.
All right. And I'll get going. So, Debbie, if you need to get me on time, let me know. But I try to be thorough. I try to give people as much information as I can, especially since you're not physically here,
I think people are very happy. Keep going.
Okay. All right. So what you'll see directly behind me are some of the neon signs that were on some of the more famous jazz clubs, restaurants, and even hotels here in Kansas City that a lot of the musicians kind of really built their name and popularity on. The interesting thing about Kansas City being that open town is the people that were involved in Vice were almost, if not more famous than the actual musicians. So you have different madams and different gamblers that were famous, and they would all have side things going on like clubs. So the underworld and the music industry always work together. So a lot of these clubs were founded by those underworld figures, and they provide the platform, the legitimate spaces and venues for these musicians to have nightly work. So that was definitely a thing. And I'm going to flip this around to give you a better view of them. And I'll give you a slow pan just to kind of see. We have Hotel Street, the Street Hotel, which was right here in the 18th and Vine area. Eleanor's Cafe, The Other Room, Rendezvous, for good drinks, Fox's Tap Room, the New Orleans Room, Milton's Tap Room. Milton's is probably one of the longest lasting jazz clubs. A lot of the greats from Duke Ellington to Louis Armstrong from around the world and the country played at Milton's. We have Top Hat Grill, Pink Door, and that is one of the original signs from the original Blue Room, I believe. So the interesting fact about a lot of the buildings here in Kansas City is about 90% of them have been demolished or torn down for urban renewal or things of that nature. So, we have just very few actual buildings that survive. So it was really cool to be able to hold on to those signs as memorabilia and just kind of as a reminder. So when you come to Kansas City, which I'm sure some of you guys may come one day after all this madness is over, and you come into the American Jazz Museum, when you come into the main exhibit, after you come down the hall, the first exhibit you'll see is Louis Satchmo Armstrong. Again, New Orleans is considered the birthplace of jazz. And if New Orleans is the birthplace of jazz, then Louis Armstrong can be considered the godfather of that birthplace or the father of the jazz style that came out of there. There were other artists before him, but Louis Armstrong took the New Orleans style of jazz and made it commercially viable with his singing, his scatting, and his trumpet playing. He was multi-talented, and the way he performed and presented the music and entertainment to people was just something that everybody loved across age groups, races, sex, anything. Louis Armstrong was just a very loved figure in pop culture and music. So him being that way kind of really opened the door for jazz to be something that was accepted by the masses and opening doors for other artists. Here we have a few examples of some of his albums and the artwork. And his exhibit is probably one of the larger ones. When you come into the exhibit here at the Jazz Museum, we have the 4 jazz masters. So those are the people that are at the center of our permanent exhibit. And those people are Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, and Charlie Parker. So this is Mr. Armstrong's exhibit. And here is a very interesting story. It does explain how Louis Armstrong left New Orleans to work with Joe King Oliver, his Joe King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band, which was which was probably Louis Armstrong's most influential mentor when it comes to music. Louis actually followed him up from New Orleans, and that's how he ended up getting out of New Orleans to bring his sound to everyone else. Had it not been for King Oliver, Louis Armstrong would have been happy being in New Orleans, because he always expressed that he didn't want to leave New Orleans until he left New Orleans. So. All right. And this is the make and model of the trumpet that Louis Armstrong played. And if you notice here, a very interesting thing is the lip salve, Louis Armstrong lip salve. So, artists marketing and cross promoting and getting endorsement deals is nothing new, but that was a very important product, because as a saxophone player and a touring, gigging musician, for those who don't know, that can be very hard on the lips. You have to have very strong chops, which are those muscles on the side of your lips by your cheeks. And that is a lot of pressure on that muscle in that part of your body. And for a trumpet player, you have to keep your lips right, because if they're cracking or if they're doing anything causing you any pain, you cannot perform. So that's kind of like a trumpet player's lifeblood. So it was very interesting that that lip salve was Louis Armstrong's brand there. So coming around, we'll come to one of my favorite musicians and one of my favorite 4 jazz masters, and that is Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington was born in Washington, D.C., and was basically known at his time, and even still today, as one of the greatest American music composers ever to live. He wrote so many songs that became hits and worked with so many artists that he got that name. They consider him the Beethoven or Mozart of what some called Black classical music or jazz, depends on what circle you're in. So Duke Ellington was very instrumental in that. Spent a lot of time in Kansas City. Worked with Charlie Parker, also joined his band at a period in time. Very admired. You have to be that to get on a U.S. stamp. I think Duke Ellington was one of the first Black Americans to be honored on a U.S. postage stamp. And here we go with just some of that that tie that I was talking about different musicians, and Mary Lou Williams sitting there basically talking about being talked about by him. Her writing and performing are and have always been just a little ahead throughout her career. She is like soul on soul. That's Duke Ellington talking about Mary Lou Williams. So again, a very influential composer and writer, even the great Duke Ellington giving her recognition for that. This is one of the scores by Mary Lou Williams, arranged 71 for Duke Ellington. So again, Mary Lou Williams writing and scoring music for Duke Ellington. Program for a show in the cities of Kyoto, Tokyo, and Kobe for Duke Ellington. And this is around 1949. So for that one, for the Japan one, the other one here to the right is from about 1963. And just to show that jazz is just, once it kind of got to the masses, it just became an international phenomenon, you know, greatly accepted and respected by people all over the world. And then approaching our third jazz master, we have the First Lady of Song, the great Miss Ella Fitzgerald. One of the premier vocalists of jazz. Ella Fitzgerald is just someone that is just synonymous with the genre of music. Someone who has been followed, and people have patterned after her even to this day. Just somebody that was really influential in the sound and the advancement and the promotion of jazz music and the Black American music experience, you know, as it pertains not only to music, but to culture. She dreamed of becoming a dancer and a singer, and sustained through tough times. You know, she was orphaned at age 15, so she had a pretty hard upbringing in life. In 1934, she decided to try her luck at an amateur night contest in Harlem, and you know, her stage fright prevented her from dancing, so she sang instead. And the audience's enthusiasm encouraged her to compete in more contests, and her fame grew. And in 1935, at 17, she was hired by the Chick Webb Orchestra. So definitely an interesting story of some hard time, a little tragedy, or a lot of tragedy and triumph, you know, just to come and become known as one of the greats. All right. And before we get to our fourth jazz master, I'm going to take you through a little area we have here, which is our studio area. This is a place that's a little more interactive, as opposed to just kind of reading some of the literature and looking at some of the exhibits. In this area, we kind of break down the different aspects of jazz, what it's composed of, rhythm, melody, how to think in jazz, you know, the kind of mentality that goes behind the creation of the music. And we also have our sound stations here. So if you or a family member, or, you know, some of the kids ever come visit, this is where you can kind of get a hands-on approach and experience with jazz. So like in the mix, you can actually take the opportunity to listen to music and then actually mix the different instruments. So if you have drums, a bass, a piano, and a saxophone, you can actually mix the sounds to get the level that you want. So you're basically acting as an engineer. So one thing we do really pride ourselves on here at the Jazz Museum is education, especially of the next generation. Yes, so yes, we do. We have a program called the Jazz Academy, which teaches jazz to youth here in Kansas City. They actually just started their semester maybe 3 weeks ago, and they'll go into the summer and have a concert at the end. And it's one of the more well-known youth jazz programs in the area. Yeah. And I do see some of these comments popping up, so I'm trying to catch some of them. Then, of course, we have harmony, which jazz is a very harmony, melody, and listening. These are very important with music, but listening is one of the main things. Jazz is known as improvisational music. And to have good improv, you need to be listening to what the other musicians are doing. The saxophone player needs to listen to the piano. The piano needs to be listening to the bass. The bass needs to be listening to the drum. And that's how you get that great style of improv where they can kind of work and mix in between and create something that's just totally original without even being written down. So see, these are some of the instruments more popularly seen in the genre of jazz. So you have reeds, which are like your saxophone or clarinet. They would be woodwind instruments in the sense that they have a wood piece that helps to amplify the sound of the instrument. So a saxophone has a wooden reed, clarinets, things like that. Then, of course, you have brass, which some people get confused and think a saxophone is brass. And even though it's made out of metal, still considered a reed instrument. But brass would be like your trumpets, trombones, things of that nature. And if you come, you can hear the sound that each one of them makes. So we have a little station here, and you press the buttons, and they give you an example of brass or whatever instrument. And then one of my favorite sections, the rhythm section. The rhythm section is the heartbeat of the song. You know, if you're listening to the drum or the bass line, the driving beat or the driving bass line rhythm, that kind of is the glue to a song. So here we have a upright bass, cymbal, and some drumsticks and brushes, just to kind of show the different styles there. Guitar and keyboard, really both stringed instruments. Even though a piano has hard keys, it has strings that actually work with the hammer. The hammers hit the strings, so it's kind of a stringed instrument as well. So it has the same principle, kind of percussion and string at the same time. That's how I look at piano. All right. And we're going to head on over to the fourth jazz master. And we'll be concluding a little bit after that. And I'll be open for some questions and to kind of go over some of the things that maybe I didn't go into detail enough, or if there's some specific questions, I'd be happy to answer. And our fourth jazz master is Mr. Charlie Parker. We just celebrated Bird's centennial, what would have been his centennial birthday this past August. You know, due to COVID, we couldn't really roll out like we wanted to and stretch out, but you know, we celebrate Bird every day, and we definitely celebrate him every year in August around his birthday. If you're ever in Kansas City, we have a Charlie Parker celebration that happens every August, and it lasts for at least a week. So there's different activities, concerts, workshops, clinics, just all centered around honoring Charlie Parker's influence and legacy. Charlie Parker is well known for his style of saxophone playing, but almost more well known for the fact that he was integral in a watershed moment in jazz where styles changed. Like I mentioned earlier, he played with Count Basie and some of the other big bands, which would have been at his time looked at as, well, that's what the older cats are doing. What are our new cats going to do? So Charlie Parker was instrumental in the birth of bebop, along with Dizzy Gillespie. Actually, right around the corner here on 19th and Vine at the old Kentuck barbecue restaurant is where Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie met. And later on that night went to the Mutual Musicians Foundation and started jamming. And that's kind of what some people credit as like the night that bebop was kind of being in its infancy stage. And of course, later on them working with Miles Davis and other artists that began to elevate that school of jazz, bebop, bop, hard bop, cool jazz, and all of the genres that came after that. So Charlie Parker not only was a great saxophonist, but he was one of those game-changing artists that certain genre and eras are marked by his playing in his time. It's actually interesting that the name Bird actually came from Jay Mcshane, who I mentioned earlier. Charlie Parker played with in his band early on in his career. They were on tour going to a gig and hit a bird, chicken, in the street. And Charlie Parker was like, hey, we're going to go back and get that bird. And Jay Mcshane, it was just so funny to him that he was like, you know, we're going to start calling you Birds. So that's a loose interpretation of how the story went. But Jay Mcshane is kind of credited for giving Charlie Parker that nickname Bird. Charlie Parker was born in Kansas City, Kansas, and shortly after his birth moved to Kansas City, Missouri, and went to Lincoln High School and learned a lot of his fundamentals and basics from the same music instructor at Lincoln High School that had brought on a lot of the other musicians before him. Now, here we have where we keep his Grafton Saxophone, which is the plastic sax that was played by Charlie Parker at what some consider the greatest jazz concert of all time at Massey Hall, with Bud Powell, Charles Mingus, and Max Roach and Dizzy Gillespie. Another historic moment in jazz in that genre of music. And the sax, I believe, was maybe only played once. It was actually kind of a loner because he didn't have his sax. So it's very interesting. The saxophone at this time is actually not even here. It's down at Epcot Center at Disney because they have a new animated film that came out called Soul, which is about a music teacher who is an aspiring jazz musician and kind of is trying to find his purpose. So they have an exhibit down there for that movie, and our saxophone is actually down there as part of a feature of the exhibit honoring Charlie Parker, jazz, and Kansas City. So, but that's what it looks like there. It just left right around the Super Bowl because it went around the Super Bowl, and I think we started talking about this before that. So it was supposed to be here, but it's not. So hopefully if you ever come visit, we'll have it back by then. I think we'll have it back maybe at the end of the summer, but it's on loan to Epcot Center now. And just lastly, before we wrap up, something we're really proud of here at the American Jazz Museum is the John H. Baker Jazz Film Collection. John Baker was just an avid film collector. You know, he just had an interest in collecting film, especially that film that documented jazz and the Black American music experience. So we actually have his collection here. It is the largest collection of film in that genre. And we're honored to have it here and currently working on digitizing it and getting it to where it's available to the masses in some form digitally so they can enjoy it and share in the treasure. So here in this area, we just kind of show some of the shorts and films that he has in his collection. So when you get a little tired from walking around, come in here and you sit down, take a little break, and watch some films from the old days of jazz and, you know, the golden era of that music form. All right. So that is just a little tour of our main exhibit and just the area that you would experience if you actually came to visit the Jazz Museum. We actually also house in the same building the Negro League Baseball Museum. So if you're ever in Kansas City, make sure you come visit that as well. It's a phenomenal museum. And you can get the whole experience here at the American Jazz Museum of both the Jazz Museum and the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum.
So you couldn't possibly have known this, but either last week or the week before, we did a program on the Negro Baseball League.
Oh, did you?
Yeah,
okay.
It was very
Did
good.
you guys get you got the, okay, great. Yeah, okay.
So,
See, they,
for those who are interested now, you know, we can add it to our collection of going to see Negro Baseball League Museum.
right.
Just like we started something with a jazz museum. So I'm going to unmute everybody,
All right.
or allow participants to unmute themselves. And I'd still ask you, if you can, to put it in chat first, and I'll, between the two of us, James and I will go through the questions. I also, just before everybody leaves, because I'm sure you want to say it again, but may not be able to, please like us on Facebook, and I'll put that up in our chat also. And check out our gorgeous website. Send me an email, hit reply to any email I send that says, and write yes, and I'll put you on our mailing list to learn about all of our fabulous, fabulous programs with people just as exciting as James, although James has set high standards for production now. So that being said, James, are you looking at chat? We have a question about how did you get involved with the museum? And thank you for a wonderful job, says Mark.
All right. Yo, thank you. I appreciate that. My involvement really is based on a family line, a heritage here. I come from a family of musicians that were born in Kansas City. My great grandfather, my grandfather, they were all musicians, and they made their way here in Kansas City before they went to the West Coast and started making music for the industry. James Gadsden, Tootie Gadsden, these are some of my relatives, so they were integral in R&B, a lot of production for Quincy Jones, but they all come from the school of Kansas City music, Kansas City jazz. So they were like, hey, if you're going to stay there in Kansas City, why don't you hang out down 18th Divine and contribute down there and help continue to build the culture. So I've been down here in the 18th Divine Jazz District for at least the last 7 years. And I guess I worked my way up to the point to where the Jazz Museum was just like, you know what, we need to have you on the team. So they brought me on for that position. So it's just a love and a family thing. That's how I got involved. And I'm an artist as well, composer, producer.
Somebody suggests that you should pitch your video toward a PBS for their permanent video library. And
I'm going to get, go ahead.
I'm done. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say we actually do have a video with PBS. One we were involved with Not From Nowhere, a story of Charlie Parker. So you may be able to see that on the PBS YouTube page, I think, at this time. I think it's actually on there. If it's not the PBS when it's on the Kansas City affiliate, which would be KCPT, it's a great documentary about Charlie Parker.
Is there a difference, asked Victoria, between KC Jazz and KC Blues?
That's a good one. KC Jazz is from Kansas City Blues. Like I mentioned before, blues predates jazz in that sense here in Kansas City, especially. You go from spiritual music to gospel to blues, then to jazz. Like I said earlier, jazz is really the combination of those African American experiences from blues and the voyage across the Atlantic to put together with Europeanized instruments and sounds. So that's what distinguishes Kansas City jazz from other jazz is that connection that it has to Kansas City blues.
Great. Okay, what if this is from Sweden? What a fantastic museum. I'm glad I came. Do they actually teach jazz to kids? Do they loan instruments or give them to students who cannot afford them?
Yeah, like I was saying, we do have the Jazz Academy program, and those students just started their program a couple of weeks ago for the spring. They'll go through the summer. It's junior high to high school. There are great musicians that come out there. It's a great program. Mr. Bobby Watson, which is one of our local jazz legends here and is renowned around the world saxophone player. He's involved with it. Clarence Smith, Gerald Dunn, and all of these people are musicians. They spend time with kids from all around the Kansas City metro area and teach them jazz, put them in bands, teach them the instruments, the theory, and they come out really knowing some stuff. And our local school college here, UMKC, the University of Missouri Kansas City, has a great conservatory program where musicians actually go and can actually study jazz and come out of that program with a great knowledge.
Great. We have some great jazz programs around here too. William Patterson University, Montclair State, a whole bunch of them. Okay, Marion, you're up.
Hi there. I know that throughout the history of early jazz, audiences were segregated, even in New York until the late 30s and beyond. What was it like in Kansas City?
Yeah, that's interesting. You know what? People ask me that question all the time when I do these tours. That's an interesting question, but the segregation was the same here in Kansas City. I think what was different was the intensity or the level of enforcement that you may have experienced in other cities like New York or down south especially. People have the impression that the further north you went, the less segregation and prejudice there was, but there really wasn't true. It's just different ways of handling it. Kansas City is a notoriously redline city. It's almost the poster child for how to segregate people geographically in a city. But as far as the audiences go, the interesting thing is the Black musicians were paid the same as the white musicians in Kansas City, if not more sometimes, but they were also allowed to play at the white clubs, but Black people couldn't patronize the clubs. On the other hand, white patrons, it wasn't that they couldn't patronize the clubs, but it wasn't widely accepted. So what happened was you have a place like the Mutual Musicians Foundation that I mentioned earlier, which was the musicians union. So after these events and these gigs, whether it was on the white side or the Black side, whether you're white or Black, musician, non-musician, you gathered at the Mutual Musicians Foundation. And we still keep that tradition to this day because we have our late night jam session on Friday and Saturday. It starts at 1 a.m. and ends at 5 a.m. on Friday and Saturday. And it's been like that for almost like the last 100 years, because that's the place where everybody can come together. And so there were those spaces in Kansas City where it can happen, but it wasn't just like a widely accepted thing.
So a quick plug here for our future programs. Speaking of birds, we're doing a program on birding later in the month.
Okay.
And we're working with the Grammy Museum to see about doing a program with them.
Yeah.
And we're also doing a program with the New Jersey Movie Commission, who will tell us about film, movie, and television commissions who work with people and work on the sets of programs shot in New Jersey. So there's that visit, and Marion says she can't wait to visit. I'm sure that would be echoed by many people here.
Yeah.
Noel says, is there a master list of Kansas City jazz musicians, either at the museum or somewhere else?
I'm sorry, you say, is there a master list?
That's right.
Of
Kansas
okay.
City jazz musicians, either
You know,
at the museum or somewhere else?
We do have a book in our swing shop. If you go to our website, which is the AmericanJazzMuseum.org, we have a book in our swing shop, and I cannot remember the title of it, but it is the history of jazz. a lot of the Kansas City jazz musicians are in there. And what happened with a lot of the Kansas City musicians was that they came here, made their bones, built their chops up, and ended up going to other places. So a lot of their history as far as being from Kansas or living here, like a Ben Webster is buried in Denmark, I believe. So, so once they left out of here, and that goes back to that earlier question from Marianne, the segregation aspect. A lot of the musicians just could not stand to live under those conditions and just kind of left, and all ties to Kansas City kind of left with them. So I wouldn't say there's a master list, but there are resources that kind of identify some of the Kansas City artists. And one of those books is in our swing shop, The History of Jazz.
And of course, you can ask your local librarian.
Yeah.
Here's a plug for the library. Also, we have a new service called Freego, where you can download music for free. And I looked at it, and I couldn't think of a genre that wasn't in there.
Mm.
Here's another question. I'm gonna let everybody unmute them. I'm asking
Okay.
everybody to unmute themselves. And is there another question? Besides, I can't wait to visit. It was probably. I think that when you open, there'll be at least 30 people sitting at the door.
Hey.
May I ask another question, Debbie?
Sure.
It's Diane.
Sure.
I was curious, in our area, we have an intergenerational orchestra for classical music. Does anything like that exist in your area, so that young musicians who go to these conservatories, and can actually play in an orchestra in your area? Is there anything like that?
Yeah. No, and I'm sorry, what's going on? I don't know. I'm hearing myself echo. Let's see here.
Talking about orchestra or jazz?
Oh, there we go. All right. Okay. Yeah, that's better. Hello. All right. So I defer back to the Mutual Musicians Foundation. The Mutual Musicians Foundation. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. The Mutual Musicians Foundation is that hub. We don't have a formal structure or organization that pairs more seasoned senior musicians with younger musicians, but the Mutual Musicians Foundation as a musician social club, that's where that takes place. That's where that's fostered. The thing about the Kansas City style has always been a very impromptu, informal, improvisational style, and it's always been about jamming. So that's where you can find somebody that's 18 years old and he'll be in there in a jam session with someone who's 70 years old, and that's where they do it.
All right, thank you.
So quick test. Does everybody know the 3 ways to stay connected to our library? 1, email me and just write your full name and yes. 2, go to our website, and 3, like us on Facebook. Okay, that's enough of that. And is there another round of questions? Stephen, do you want to ask the question?
Yeah, you have a question? We have a question.
Okay, Mike and Jackie.
Hi. Hi, Debbie.
So I just wanted to take a second and thank you for your efforts to promote this program. I really appreciate it. And WBGO, I appreciate too. So thank you. Go ahead, Jackie and Mike.
Well, it was our pleasure, and glad to do it. And we enjoyed the program very much, and listening to James about the museum. I used to go to Kansas City a lot on business, but it was before the museum was open.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But I used to stay at the Vista Hotel, where the banquet rooms are all named after jazz musicians. There was a Count Basie room and a Charlie Parker room.
Oh, wow. Okay. Okay.
I don't know if it's still there, but.
Now, was that downtown?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, right in the middle of downtown. It's called the Vista, and maybe called something else now. I don't know. But I just wanted to mention, someone had asked about a list of Kansas City musicians, and I took a look at Wikipedia. There's an article in Kansas City Jazz that has a very long list of musicians associated with Kansas City, and you can click on each one and learn about them.
Okay. Yeah. You know what? We actually had a Wikipedia marathon 2 years ago. So I did forget to mention that. And when I'm thinking of list, I'm thinking of an actual physical. But we did have a Wikipedia marathon where a group of enthusiasts were here at the Gym Theater, and they kind of went through the whole page and added people and kind of took the people of note, added them. So I'll make sure I share that with people as well. I'm glad you found that resource there.
Okay. I was just curious, Mike, is that picture behind you related to jazz?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
This is a famous photograph called
Yeah.
Great Day in Harlem, 1958.
Yeah.
And it has 57 to 58 prominent jazz musicians based in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
So, Basie's in it, and Dizzy, and Mary Lou Williams is in it, who you mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And and we ever saw a movie called The Terminal.
Okay.
Tom Hanks a few years ago. This picture played a major part in it.
Mhm. Just a footnote on that picture. I volunteer at the New York Museum, and I've been there over 10 years. And one of the pictures that sells often is this particular one.
Mm-hmm.
They have it, and they sell it. And I just wanted to say, I've been there 10 years, and that's where I learned about jazz, because I was
Wow.
volunteering, and I got to meet a lot of the jazz performers. We're not gonna be doing it this summer, but we're gonna be opening up again next year.
Joys
Okay.
of volunteering.
The only people in the picture who are still alive are Benny Golson and Sonny Rollins.
Yeah.
And the movie was, at the end of the movie, the Tom Hanks character meets Benny Golson and gets his autograph. He was trying to get the autographs from everybody.
And Marion adds that, is this the photo where Willie the Lion Smith walked away the moment it was taken?
I think so, yes.
I think so.
Okay, great. So I think I'm going to end this. I'll stay on for a minute or two, but I want to thank all of you for coming. And again, James and I discussed this for a long time. He put a lot of effort into this. And I hope that we all appreciate him. There's a lot of good comments in the chat section, and I'll just say, let's see if I can figure out how to do a reaction. Okay, so we're clapping away. I'm going to stop recording right now and just thank you, James, and thanks to all of you for coming.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Debbie.
Thank you
very
James.
much.
It was terrific.